Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, as Peter said, it's a shorter talk. And again, I'm not going to be presenting any resources or particular sort of ontologies and infrastructures people presented before, just to give a little overview on some of the topics that both I've seen presented over the last couple of days and also some of the things that we come across in Elixir. Just have just a couple of slides to introduce Elixir for those who aren't familiar. I'm sure many of you are, but many may not be. So it's a European infrastructure. We have 22 nodes across Europe. One of them also is the EBI as well. And we have a number of different resources across those nodes, databases, training courses, software tools, and so on. Across that network, one of the most important groups are the sets of communities. So again, we've seen today, obviously, that biodata is complex across all different topics, fields. We were talking about single cell, metagenomics, and so on. So this complex field, we try and capture it by having our communities which have specific focuses in different scientific areas. And then these are a mechanism of kind of long-term collaborations with other S3s, European infrastructures as well. Then from a technical perspective, we have our 5 platforms. So the compute, data, tools, interoperability, and training platforms. I look after the data interoperability platforms. Again, this is just a structure within Elixir in terms of how we work. But within the data platform, one of the things we have are our Elixir core data resources. And again, you've seen a couple of slides today referencing that in terms of those resources being labeled as such. This is basically a formal process within which members of Elixir can submit their resource, data resource, or knowledge base for assessment. So it goes for peer review, panel meets our head of nodes, approve, and then the resource becomes designated as a core data resource. We currently have 31 resources, and also 16 of those are what are called deposition databases, so they accept data from the public. Again, just a quick logo cloud. So again, we're covering all different domains from sort of chemical domains. We have Uniprot there, POM-based, Swiss Model, Magnify, ENA. So again, we're trying to, as much as possible, to cover the core resources in life sciences in Europe. And again, we've heard the term open data, open science quite a few times, both in this session and also in other sessions around. And I think most of us would agree open data is an important part of this. And one of the things this open data enables within the Elixir ecosystem, at least, is that we have integration. So we've seen that as Glygen referred to pulling data from other sources and so on, Magnifies analyzing ENA data. But that depends on this openness of data. So we have core data resources can be referenced by various RDM, knowledge bases, Fair Cookbook, the training support services, biotools for analysis, registries, and so on. So again, this ecosystem depends on this free flow of information. As a separate point, so the core data resource is one of the things that we actually look at as what we call indicator monitoring. So once a resource is designated as a CDR, then it undergoes annual monitoring. We measure around 13 metrics. These are sort of quantitative metrics, cover things like usage, resource allocation, and bibliometrics. You can see in the first 2 graphs in terms of web page views and data volume, again, they're going almost exponential there. So we see this constant increase in what's in our resources, the amount of data they have, the amount of users. But one thing that we've noticed more recently is literature mentions are starting to plateau. This is older data, but a sneak preview of kind of this year's data is around, skipping to the next slide. Is a plateau in literature mentions. So again, this is something we sort of saw at the 2022 metrics, but actually we're seeing this in the last 2 years as well. And this kind of raises some questions. We talked, it was referred to earlier in terms of Amos's keynote and looking at, the inbox never gets smaller and so on, but actually why are we getting increased usage, increased databases, but the mentions within the literature of our resources are starting to plateau. So what's going on here? And I think some of the topics coming up relate to kind of this balancing of openness, stewardship, and sustainability. So again, how do resources such as the ones presenting today and many of the others address this challenge in terms of access and analyze data and how it's changing? So things like automation and AI, we've heard about high volume scraping and API throttling. So some of our resources have talked about sort of being hammered by lots of bots and scraping. And this is becoming a challenge for some of them. The idea of fair, which I think most of us subscribe to, but doesn't necessarily mean a free-for-all in terms of having some regulation there. But we do still want to practice the open science and open data. So we're trying to balance that with sustainability and responsible stewardship. We talked about curation in some of the other talks as well, and that this is valuable. But again, distinguishing that kind of curation effort from some of the infrastructure, some of these cool infrastructures, hybrid or otherwise, and the data creation efforts kind of run in parallel, not necessarily overlapping. And then we need detailed user analytics. So we need to look at things like impact assessments to demonstrate value, but you also don't want to create extra friction for scientists. We don't want to limit the ability of other resources and other scientists to use their data. And then the idea of how, whether we had some concepts such as pay for submission. So we can have scientists having data sets they want to put their Xenium data and they want to put it there. They're offering to pay for that. That's an interesting model, but one of the other ones that's been discussed is around having the scientists pay, but then this also means if we change licenses, other resources that are all now interconnected might not be able to interconnect as well because suddenly they're not able to import that data if that data has a restricted license. So again, these are some of the challenges that are affecting all of the resources in general. And then also challenges of legacy infrastructure. So again, to this session, talking about some of the scalable infrastructure. So some of our core data resources have been around for a long time. Some of them actually predate kind of the open science, open source licensing standards. Some of them talk about having 20-year-old code that is in a university thesis and it falls under copyrights. This makes open sourcing this challenging. So then the obvious solution would be, okay, well, let's upgrade and change your process. But then this is a question of, if it's not broken, why fix it? How do you get funding to completely revamp your whole infrastructure if infrastructure is still working? And then trying to balance the kind of open science principles versus political and practical constraints within these resources. But I think ultimately addressing these issues now, and I think this is one of the purposes of this session and these discussions, is really to support this long-term resilience of the databases. And then, yeah, just to conclude, then really, again, this is one of the taglines we use at Elixir, and I put in bold that sort of together we accelerate the understanding of life. So again, this is a network of people, a network of interested parties, and that value requires kind of coordination, not just code. That metrics matter. So again, I showed some plots there, but they don't just measure success, they also guide support, so what challenges we need to address. And that the legal, technical, institutional realities can shape what openness and fairness can look like in reality. Again, whether we agree with it or not, but we should try and be cognizant. And then interoperability, again, we heard about the F and the A are manageable, but the I and the R not so much. So that's a community effort across institutes and borders. And again, a quote, he's going to cringe because in the audience, but yes, the data sustainability panel yesterday, I thought it was a useful quote. I was thinking about, rather than thinking as individual resources, we should build a network that's resilient to perturbations. So again, just like to finish on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabio. Does anyone have any questions or reflections at this stage? I don't mind looking at Tony.
So I'm going to ask you a question about that quote. So one of the things that I got after I'd said it, right, is it's easy to say that, but it's actually hard to do.
Mm-hmm.
So have you got any thoughts on how the Elixir framework helps to build that network that's resistant to perturbation?
Yeah, I mean, I think this session is an example of the effort from the Elixir side to put in to bring resource owners, managers, contributors into the same room to talk about these things, to have these presentations and talk about CWL to Nextflow, whether we use Prefect, whether we do hybrid, on-prem, not, how to manage curation. So I think that's one of the efforts. But I do have plans over the next while to have more dedicated meetings. Julia at the start mentioned the fact that she's building this kind of ontology across the German node resources, but again, I think it's better to expand that out further. So I think bringing people together to talk about these things is a good first step.
You can ask what kind of perturbations did you have in mind? Can you remember?
I couldn't I'm not going to say the obvious thing. No. I mean, I think in general, I think it's very easy to think about sustainability in terms of individual resources, and actually, I think as Fabio said, and as we've seen, thinking about pathways that run across, one database, longitudinal workflow, which and the results of that go into a different database. You really need to sustain those networks. So we think about when certain things happen and reliable funding sources are suddenly diminished, the impact that has on databases. We don't always think about the impact that has on workflows and pathways and avenues of research. I dodged that question.
Might have throw a comment out. Something I didn't get to say in my talk, but that we've been kicking around recently there was I can't remember what this stands for, but there was something, the acronym was ASAP. There was a request for information on related to AI and data and how we deal with this. And so there was a figure in the response that we put out there that there's 6 orders of magnitude more data in silos than has been trained by AI. And how do we get access to that? And it feels like how can we, and so one of the solutions that we talked about in that was forming a network, just like we were just saying, forming some sort of network where we can share those data that are now siloed and make it available. And so I think there's a big opportunity with, hopefully with the demand for AI that, eventually people will realize that we're just, are realizing that we're running out of good data, and that will give us some impetus to band together, and there'll be funding to do it.
I have many opinions, but I promised I'd let Fabio speak, so